Hello world, my name is Hristina Crenn, a webinar series intern for One Health Lessons. Today I have the absolute privilege to talk with Dr. Mark Pokras, who is actually a doctor of veterinary medicine and has been working in the field of wildlife for a very long time. So today we'll hear from him an interesting story about his experience and his approach towards the notion of One Health and the future of One Health as well. And we will also talk a little bit about the relation between One Health as a notion and social sciences. Dr. Pokras, hello. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Hristina. Good to talk with you.
Thank you very much as well. Could you please briefly present yourself? Tell us a little bit more about your academic and professional background.
Surely. Well, let's see. I'm in my 70s now. Technically, I'm retired, although I'm still pretty much working full time. But I've been working in wildlife for the last more than 50 years. I started out as an ornithologist and ecologist and worked on endangered wildlife in the United States for a number of years. And that's really where I got involved in health issues. I was working on population biology, and this was back in the era of DDT and some of the hard pesticides. And we were looking at why animals were suffering from some of these chemicals, and that got me interested in health. And we can go into that story in more depth if you want to at some point. But I was working as an environmental biologist, a wildlife biologist, got interested in health issues through, again, pesticides, through oil spills, through pollution primarily. And I realized that I was between disciplines. I was a wildlife biologist, but I was talking to people who were in the health professions. And I realized that we were talking at cross purposes. You know, they didn't understand about wildlife. I didn't understand about health, and we needed somebody who could translate, who could cross those disciplinary boundaries. And it was that, again, through a series of adventures that made me think I should go back to graduate school at that point. And I was thinking about a PhD, but a friend of mine actually suggested that I look into veterinary medicine, and I did. And I'm very glad I went in that direction. Because now I have both trainings. I have training in wildlife biology, but I also have health training. And I was at Tufts at the veterinary school there for 35 years, where I directed the wildlife program. I also directed our program in conservation medicine, which is sort of the One Health equivalent, and taught in the public health program. And so I've worked in all of these areas. I've worked in wildlife biology, I've worked in conservation biology, I've worked in human public health, and I work in animal health as well. And so I think seeing these things separate and seeing how people tend to not understand the connections between the things really made me want to dedicate my time to, as you were saying earlier, sort of the social science aspect of this. How do we get people to cross the disciplinary boundaries and share their knowledge and share their perspectives? Because the answers aren't with any one science. You know, the veterinarians don't know all the answers. The public health people don't know all the answers. The MDs don't know all the answers. We need to be talking together. We need to be sharing our experiences. And so those are the kinds of things I look forward to talking with you more about today.
Absolutely. I was wondering, in your opinion, what is the future of One Health from a wildlife perspective? And for instance, if you, while mentioning this, could you please also mention briefly what is the relation between being a wildlife biologist and at the same time being a veterinarian? I'm really curious to know.
Sure. Well, let's see if I can make this relatively simple. I mean, if you look at the history of wildlife biology, it has mostly focused on wildlife species that are important to people. From two perspectives. One would be those species that we utilize, that for fishing or for hunting, for food, for recreation. And so a lot of wildlife biology has focused on those species. What do we go out and hunt and eat or fish for, or something of that nature? The other part of wildlife biology has focused on conservation. It's focused on endangered species. What species are becoming rare and why are they becoming rare? And what can we do to, whether it's elephants or California condors or vultures in Africa, what are the things we can do to sort of save these species? Because we understand that they're important in how ecosystems work. We need all these species and their biological complexity. So that's sort of what wildlife biologists do. They focus on the well-being of the wild animals as a population. What veterinarians tend to do is they focus on the health more of individuals. So if you think about, I don't know if you have pets, if you have a dog or a cat or a horse or anything else, but when your pet becomes ill, you take it to the veterinarian.
Yeah.
And he or she can, it's like being a doctor. They do measurements, they take x-rays, they take blood, they try and help that individual animal. And the other thing that veterinarians do is when they're dealing with food animals in particular, when veterinarians are dealing with cattle or sheep or goats or camels, then we're dealing not only with the individual sheep or camel, but we're also dealing with the population, with the herd health, and how the population of those animals is doing in terms of disease or reproduction or any of those things. And so the veterinarian, it's interesting. In human medicine, we have drawn a line between MDs who focus on individual people's health and public health professionals that focus on the population of human beings. Those are two separate professions. In veterinary medicine, there's no such separation. So veterinarians focus both on the individual animal, but also on the population of animals. And that's where veterinarians and wildlife biologists overlap. Because if you think about, it could be in Switzerland, it could be in Africa, it could be in China. If you have a herd of domestic animals, whether they're camels or sheep or cattle, and you have those animals out and they're grazing in the mountains or in the woods, they're coming into contact with wild animals. And so there can be an exchange of diseases or parasites, or maybe the wild animals and the domestic animals are competing for food or for water. And so again, veterinarians find that they have to work with wildlife biologists to protect both species. We want to protect both the domestic animals that are important to people and the economy and human health, but we want to protect the populations of wildlife as well.
Absolutely. And, like, for instance, it will be really interesting to know from both perspectives, what will be the future of One Health in terms of, like research, evolution of research in the future. What is your opinion briefly about this? Like, how can we relate this to One Health?
Sure. Well, let me go back just a step for a minute.
Of course.
One of the terms I used earlier was conservation medicine.
Yes.
Which is almost identical to One Health. That we started using that term before we were using One Health, and to a certain extent, it's a perspective question. I think veterinarians tend to use the term conservation medicine, and human health people tend to use the word One Health. And if you think about the classic Venn diagram, the three circles: human health, animal health, environmental health, that overlap with One Health. MDs and public health people are primarily concerned about human health. And so they think one circle is the most important circle. Veterinarians see the three circles as of equivalent importance. I often say, as a veterinarian, one of the things that differentiates veterinarians from human doctors is, as a veterinarian, some of my best friends are people, but not all of my best friends are people. Many of my best friends are other species. And I think so there's a mindset difference. I think that when we use the term conservation medicine, we're realizing that many of these other species are ecologically as important or maybe even more important than human beings are. And so there's this philosophical difference a little bit between the focus of conservation medicine and the conservation of One Health that tends to focus on human beings. Not that I like human beings. As I say, many of my best friends are human beings. Um, Let me think. I wanted to go back to your original question there.
About the future of One Health.
Yeah,
Of,
I think that it depends on where you sit at the moment. I mean, let's think about, I mean, you're in Turkey.
yes.
I'm in the United States. What's the big One Health issue right now today? COVID.
Yes. And
Okay.
it is the most pronounced word in the world currently, COVID.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a classic One Health problem. I'll give you an example with that. In 2000, I'd have to go back and look. I believe it was 2003. I was part of a group of scientists that went to China, not to Wuhan, but we went to several cities in China, and we inspected Chinese wet markets where they were selling animals.
Yes.
And they were selling domestic animals, but they were also selling wild animals in China. And all of us were very alarmed. And we wrote a long report. And I can tell you all the people who were on that report about how the next pandemic could come from these wet markets in China, because we were mixing the diseases of wild animals and the diseases of domestic animals and people right together.
It could be also a cultural thing, I think. Cultural feature of China.
But this was, well, and it's not just China. We see this sort of thing take place in Africa and in Latin America and in many.
I'm not familiar either.
Yeah, not in such a large scale, not in such a commercial. But you think about, for instance, bushmeat is the term I think they often use in Africa.
Yes.
And you can buy bushmeat, on many street corners, when I was in Tanzania, in Arusha or something like that. But anyway, I mean, we saw back in 2003 where some of these pandemics were coming from. And we wrote a report. Several of us testified in front of the government here in the United States about the possibility of the emergence of pandemics. Nobody listened. No money was put into studies for this. Nobody tried to stop the emergence of disease. And so today we have COVID. And there will be other pandemics after this, I'm sure. This is not the last pandemic. But I think that's what's driving One Health right today, as you and I sit and talk about this, is the fact that we have a global emergency. So I think from the point of view of human health, this is a major focus of One Health because it's affecting the economy. It's affecting, thousands and thousands of people are dying every day around the world, whether you're in a rich country or you're in a poor country. It's stimulated the production of all these vaccines. It's upset the world. Maybe we've got a handle on it now with vaccines, although there's some tremendous inequalities between the rich countries and the poor countries. But that's one driver for One Health in the future, is preventing future pandemics.
Actually, yes, absolutely. And for instance, because today we'll be talking also about social sciences, I would like to mention recently in one of the research papers that I was writing and is getting published this week, actually, is already in international journal in Bosnia. It is about social sciences, but it is, I was studying the transitional society of the Bosnian case in the role of women in the post-war reconstruction of Bosnia. And basically, I mentioned one sentence that triggered me and struck me after I read the whole article published in the journal. I didn't, put too much attention while I was writing it, but it struck me, that sentence. And I wrote, It seems that legal provisions are dormant for a longer period of time, and they tend to wake up only when a civil war occurs or when a problem occurs in the society. So
Right.
that is, like an alarm. So when I read that written by myself, it struck me. I said, "Why I said this?" But to some extent, it's true. It seems, as you said, that governments do not listen when scientists write relevant reports about some recent studies or research that has been or had been conducted. So basically, also I think that governments are dormant until
Sure.
a pandemic or a social problem occurs, right? Then
Yeah.
everyone wakes up. The life before COVID-19, what it was, we were living a normal life, and suddenly when COVID-19 happened, everything seemed to be different. And that
Yeah.
difference, that means that suddenly only does that mean that only during a pandemic or only during a social problems legal rules are implemented? This is what I was trying to argue a little
Sure.
bit.
Sure. No, you're touching on an extremely important point there, and it's not just with health issues.
Absolutely.
Um, let me just a couple of examples on this. I think part of what we're dealing with is human nature here.
Yeah.
um, I have a granddaughter who's 12 years old, and she's in school, and she has homework assignments. She has to write reports and things like that. Now, you and I know if you have to write a report, you should start the day you get the assignment and do it a little bit at a time. And you
Yes.
know, but what do we all do? We wait until the night before it's due, and then we panic and we go, "Oh my gosh, I have to write the report." And we stay up all night and we write the report. Another example of that would be climate change.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I'm old enough that I was at the first Earth Day. um, I marched down the street with my banners in the first Earth Day about climate change. That was 1970. That was 50 years ago. Have we known climate change was coming? Absolutely. What did we do about it in the intervening 50 years? Not a lot. Not
Absolutely.
a lot. We had to wait until the sea level is starting to rise and the ice caps are
Or the rise
melting.
of the temperature for 1 degree already.
Sure. And of course, one of the things that's happening as sea level rises is now we have a refugee crisis. Millions of people are having to leave Bangladesh because the ocean is coming up, and we're going to see more and more of these things coming together. And this is a problem, I think, not with any one issue, not just with COVID and emerging disease, and not just with climate change, but it's a problem with our species and how our minds work. I think that our political systems don't want to deal with an issue until it becomes an emergency. And how do we change that? And that's where the social sciences come in. We have to have our politicians set up um, systems. We have to allocate money years and years and years in advance to deal with these things before it becomes an emergency, but we're not good at that.
Yes, to some extent, many social issues are uh, difficult to manage when they occur suddenly, when
Yes.
there is not some sense of preparedness. And in this case, for instance, you have mentioned before that, or I mean, you told me that you have been teaching One Health as a class in Brazil.
Yes.
Have you conducted such missions in other parts of the world? And peculiarly, how it was your experience in Brazil regarding this?
Yeah. Well, it was called conservation medicine then, but it's the same sort of thing. Basically, we started teaching this at my university at Tufts in 1996. Um, that's when we had our first course on this, and we started our Center for Conservation Medicine at the veterinary school at Tufts in 1996. And I worked then with some other organizations, Wildlife Trust, that was headed by Mary Pearl at that point, and I worked with a veterinarian, Alonso Aguirre, um, who was very committed to this early on. And we put together a course that first we taught at Tufts. And because Alonso has a lot of international connections in Latin America, he and I then went to Brazil, where we worked with a Brazilian conservation organization, IPE, um, and taught the conservation medicine course in Brazil for the first time. We had wonderful attendance. My Portuguese has gotten a little better. Falo um pouco de português.
Congratulations.
Yeah, yeah. I'm still working on my languages. You know, most of my languages are Romance languages. But anyway,
I understand.
um, and I understand that you like Latin American music, but we can come back to
Yeah, sure, a lot.
that. But yeah, and so I had a chance to teach that in Brazil. I've also done lectures on that in several other Latin American countries, and then working with some collaborators in the U.S. and in Taiwan. We have taught a course in Taiwan a couple of times on conservation medicine, and then when I was in China with the group from EcoHealth Alliance, gave some lectures in China on some of these One Health topics. Now, I was focused on one of the other lectures was focused on emerging infectious disease. I was focused on environmental pollutants. I talk a lot about the metals, in particular, lead poisoning and mercury poisoning and things that are significant problems in many developing countries. So it's not all disease.
Yes, indeed. You know, there. I think it is very important in this society or in this world where we are living currently to promote the paramount importance of the interdependence or diversity among sciences. Every science is
Absolutely.
related to another. For instance, many people in the region where I'm living do not endorse the policies regarding university curriculums,
Mhm.
etc., because people tend, or would like to specialize in one field and that's it. But in my opinion, that is perhaps too much narrowed down. People
Yeah.
should explore furthermore. I found a very interesting term in your CV, and that is called ornithology. What does that mean?
It's the study of birds.
Okay, can you briefly tell us more what that science does? Like, is it about the diseases type or?
Well, no, and it's interesting that you should ask that. I was on a Zoom call yesterday. um, Basically, if you think about the taxonomy of different animals on the planet or plants, I mean, somebody who studies plants is called a botanist in English. Somebody who studies birds is an ornithologist. Somebody who studies fish is an ichthyologist. Somebody who studies mammals is a mammologist. And typically, people who do that study the anatomy of those species, or they study the behavior of those species, or they study the ecology of those species. They don't generally study health issues. So very few ornithologists look at the health of birds. But literally, yesterday I was on a call with a bunch of ornithologists who are doing research on endangered birds. And I was saying, and this is that issue of crossing disciplines. They're capturing the birds and they're putting bands on their legs and they're measuring the birds and they're weighing the birds to study them out in the wild and to do conservation. And so what I was saying is, while you've got that bird in your hands, you can take some samples for health. We can take some feathers. We could take some feces, some poop. We could take some blood. We could take swabs from the mouth or something like that, and we could learn a lot about their diseases and their parasites and
It
everything.
sounds like archaeology excavation, actually.
Oh,
Oh,
a lot,
it
a
sounds like
lot.
that.
Yeah. And so, I might want to study the health of the birds for several different reasons. For instance, this is an endangered bird that they're studying. It's called the black-capped petrel. It's an ocean bird, lives out on the ocean. And I might just want to study the bird to help protect that bird where it lives. But I also know that by studying that bird, I can gain information about the ocean that it lives in. And ocean health affects all of us. We know the oceans are changing. Plus, we also know that there are diseases like avian influenza,
Yeah.
infectious diseases that are transmitted from wild birds to domestic birds to people.
And I found also that term in your CV, like avian anatomy. So what does avian means? I'm not quite sure. Could
Oh,
you tell?
avian is another word for bird.
Okay,
Yeah,
excellent.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Um, so much in English depends on where the word came from, whether it's of Latin origin or Greek
Yes.
origin or German origin or something like that. So, yeah. And I'm
Okay.
sure that's true in other languages as well.
Absolutely. It is the first time that I encountered these two terms like ornithology and avian anatomy. So I was curious to know more about them. And thank you for
Sure.
explaining briefly. In my region where I'm living, we are always mentioning, we're always saying, a veterinary, a vet, that's it. But
Sure.
it seems like there are many categories. For instance, you're at the same time a wildlife biologist and a wildlife veterinarian, which is
Right.
seems that this categorization among sciences is very crucial. So I am wondering, where does all of this come from? Is it because we categorize sciences, or basically it is just like an academic evaluation or significance for like kind of
Yeah.
um,
That's a great question. And first, let me say, I'm not an expert on that, but I'll give you my opinion.
sure,
Okay.
absolutely.
I think there are two things that feed into that. One is that different people have different interests. For example, I have a brother who is a geologist who studies rocks.
Yes.
Um, and he loves being a specialist. All he wants to do is go in the field and look under the microscope and do his studies and study rocks, rocks, rocks. Um, and he doesn't want to look wider than that. He loves, and so the way his brain works is as a specialist. And I think we need specialists in this world. People who are studying rocks, or people who are studying birds, or people who are studying infectious viruses, people who have a tremendous amount of expertise in a small area are extremely important. But then there are people like me, and probably like you, whose brains don't work that way. you
Absolutely.
know,
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, my brain is all over the map.
Yeah.
If you look at the books in my library, I have books about rocks, and I have books about plants, and I have
Same.
books about birds, and I have books about social behavior.
Well, I'm
Eh,
studying social sciences, but I must say that my biggest interest is about archaeology and ancient history,
Sure,
not
sure.
military history at all. I think military history is overstudied. It's overplayed.
Oh, I agree. I agree. But of course, so much of archaeology is social science.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I took a lot of sociology when I was in college, so I'm and anthropology. I took a lot of
Absolutely.
anthropology
Great
courses.
science.
I'm
A great
very
science.
interested in that.
Yes.
But anyway, so I think there's a real difference in people. Some people like to be specialists, other people like to cross disciplinary lines. But going back to your other point, I think one of the problems we have is that our system in academia, in colleges and universities, rewards people for being selfish. Um, if you think about, my being a professor in a university, okay, I had to get the job. I wrote up my CV. I sent you my CV,
Yes.
and in there, what I have to do is I have to say how wonderful I am. You know,
Yes.
here are all the papers that I wrote. Here are all the grants that I got. Here are all the things where my name comes first.
Yes.
You know, you don't get rewarded for being a good sharer, for being collaborative with other people. And I think part of the problem we have is that we've built systems that are rewarding selfishness rather than rewarding collaboration and sharing. And that needs to change as well.
Yes. Like I think in the region where I'm living, basically, categorization, it's a problem in terms of sciences. Like generally among people who are not affiliated with academia, they seem
Yeah,
to say, "Oh, what is that? I never heard of it."
yeah,
And it seems like only if you're really affiliated with academia, or if you have done a little research by yourself, you could really and truly understand that categorization is necessary in academia and while you conduct research, because that helps you, it somehow, when you write a research paper, for instance, you are trying to write keywords, and that
sure.
keywords are explaining basically the field or of expertise that you're having, or maybe the one that you're researching, not always the field of your expertise, for instance.
Right.
And perhaps I have one more last question that I'm curious to know. What do you think about, for instance, you have mentioned conservation medicine. We
Sure.
have mentioned One Health. Um, I think that conservation medicine, it is also very much related to social sciences. In terms of how do we see medical law for the future, but also its evolution. I don't know, perhaps maybe how to scientifically frame this question, but you can tell me, like, if we relate, in your opinion, if we relate One Health and conservation medicine to be this exactly same science, what can we expect for the future?
That's a very complicated
Yeah, it is
question.
very complicated, but I think there is so much relation. I don't know.
Right, right. Well, I think one of the big needs is to educate people outside of our disciplines. You asked before, what is ornithology and what does it do? Or what is wildlife biology and what does it do? Um, I think the fact that many disciplines are so narrow, we can't appreciate what other people do. And I'll give you an example that bothers me all the time, and that is our elected officials.
Yes,
Okay. Now I only know the United States well.
yes,
The European Union and
yes,
Macedonia
yes,
much better than I do.
yes,
But here in the United States, when I look at our elected officials, they're mostly men,
yes,
they're mostly older,
yes.
they're mostly upper class,
Indeed.
and they're mostly lawyers. Okay. And lawyers have no training in the sciences at all.
Exactly.
They
And
don't understand biology, they don't understand statistics, they don't understand medicine, they don't understand conservation. And so they tend to see the world in one particular way. If you're a lawyer, the answer is innocent or guilty,
yeah,
black and white. There's
actually,
no,
this is the
there's,
problem I faced in law school, and I still face it. All my professors just talk about public and private law, like
yeah,
medical law doesn't exist, or like conservation medicine law doesn't exist.
yeah,
It's like all the legal words about private and public law, and
yeah,
eventually international, and that's
yeah,
it.
yeah. And in fact, that's not the way the world works.
Absolutely.
Instead of being right or wrong, innocent or guilty, black or white, the world is many shades of gray. And if you study biology, we understand that the world is many fine differentiations. And so I think partly when we're educating people, whether it's in secondary school or in university or things like that, we need to have more of this interdisciplinary education, so that people don't specialize too early,
Yes.
so that people who want to become lawyers have taken a science course, or a social science course or
Yes.
something like that, so that we understand some of these complications. In fact, there's a book I was going to recommend to you, that was recommended to me by a social scientist here in the United States. Um, it's called Navigating Environmental Attitudes by Thomas Haberlin.
Navigating environmental attitudes.
Right.
Thomas Haberlin. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's a short book. It's a small paperback. I've read it 3 times now. But this is how a social scientist looking at how people form their environmental attitudes. Now, he's not talking about health issues. He's talking about conservation issues. but I think many of the points that he brings up are apropos of health issues as well. And I think this is one of the big things that the One Health field needs is it can't just be scientists talking to scientists. You know, as I said earlier, a lot of my work in One Health is not on disease issues, it's on toxic issues. It's on lead poisoning. I work with people in Australia and India and Latin America on lead poisoning every day. Um, it's a big problem around the world in Nigeria. Um,
Yes, and that also explains about the water quality
Absolutely.
of the
Yeah.
state.
But it has economic implications, you know, the industries in given areas. It has gender implications, you know, are the children more exposed or the women or the men and why?
Or maybe also we can qualify that as waterborne diseases as well, because there is some level of toxic materials in the water that
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
provoke diseases in the human body, basically.
And often they interact. There's a friend of mine in Brazil who's done some work in the Amazonas um, where they mine for gold. And in mining for gold, they use a lot of mercury in the mining. And mercury is very toxic to people and other animals. And one of the things that they found is if people are exposed to mercury, it makes them more sensitive to malaria.
Yes.
And so the disease and the pollutant work together to impact human health. And you can't understand, if you're only studying the disease, you'll never understand the whole process. You have to understand the mercury, you have to understand the mining industry, you have to understand how people are making a living. And so all of these things have to go together to understand the big problem. And that's One Health.
Yes,
Because
that is the future of One Health also, I think, in terms of, we need to interrelate concept, understand them, study them
yeah,
from different perspectives, and perhaps to make like this, we can make the world a better place for living, not for only us, but for everyone else.
I totally agree. And, and one thing that I talk to my veterinary students about all the time, and this goes, do you know the term academic silos?
Yes, I know it, yes.
Okay. You know, veterinarians tend to talk to veterinarians. You go to veterinary meetings, you read veterinary magazines, your mind tends to be, you know, veterinary medicine. And so one of the things I say to the veterinary students all the time is you have to get out of the silo. You
Yes.
know, you have to, a veterinarian who's interested in One Health things should be reading human health journals. You know, I read the New England Journal of Medicine, I read the Lancet, I read the Beijing Journal of Medicine, you know, on a regular basis to see the human health stuff. But I also read the ecological journals from Society of Conservation Biology or you know, the British Journal of Ornithology or Sula. You have to see what's going on in all these other disciplines as well,
Yeah.
and spread your mind out. And so this is where we need people like you know, people who have broad minds, who are looking not just at the narrow science areas, because the narrow science areas will not solve the problems.
Absolutely.
You need the science. You know, when we're dealing with COVID again, we need the virologists. We need somebody who can invent vaccines. But that's not all we need. You
Yeah.
know, we need the lawyers, we need the policy people, we need the public health people to get everybody vaccinated and stop this terrible pandemic.
Yes, and I truly hope that we will stop it as soon as possible, and the normal life will return again for all of us. Dr. Pokras, thank you a lot today for delivering this wonderful contribution of yours. It was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you really a lot again. And I really learned today perhaps one important notion, that conservation medicine and One Health are very similar notions. So thank
Right.
you for teaching me these important concepts today mainly. And I would like to wish you good luck with your future research projects, and hopefully to talk to you soon.
That would be great. Thank you so much for
You're welcome.
Hristina. It's been wonderful talking with you. All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.